My name's James and I paint minis. This is Spoon 37 Minis.
So in the previous video you saw me adding Sotek Green to the Carapace on the Hive Tyrant. I've already done the torso and legs as shown here, but now we're going to continue by doing all the extra pieces, the tail, the head and the arm carapace. Right, starting off with the tail, this has already had the black and the deep blue stages, and so now we're starting off with a thin line at the edge of each plate in Sotek Green, which is slightly lighter colour, as well as a slight line down the side and the centre. Now on just the first couple of plates, you'll notice that I'm mainly just doing a line at the edge, a line in the centre, and then a line at the very edge of the plate. As I go further along, the plates get a little bigger, I start to do some striations in between those two extremes. I still need to leave room for the lighter colour, but obviously at this point we're still trying to work this striated pattern onto the tail. The plates are very small compared to some of the other areas, so maybe it's not that important, but I still want to try and get as many parallel lines as I can for this scheme to take effect. There you can see I'm doing the first one, and then on the next plate I should do a couple of lines just on this side in between the one I'm doing now and the one on top. Apologies if there's a bit of shaking. I have actually knocked the camera once or twice. I'm just trying to get a kind of eye level view, and unfortunately means the camera is quite close to my hands and arms. And so whilst I'm painting okay, I have knocked the camera once or twice, so it does wobble about a little bit, unfortunately. I don't know if you noticed in the previous clip, but the Sotek Green lid managed to snap shut on me. So now it has a tube jammed in there that you get with paintbrushes to keep it open. And now I can carry on painting in exactly the same manner, but it just means I took a little break in between clips there. Now it's no doubt occurred to you at this point that I'm only doing this one side at the moment. I'll have to flip it around and do the other side as appropriate. I just thought it was a good idea to do this side continuously so you can see what I'm doing, and then when I flip it over we'll do exactly the same steps, it'll just be on the other side of the tail, so then both sides will be done, and then I'll have to do the tail tip, which fortunately should be a little bit easier. Now you will see me going to the palette quite frequently to do this. I am using a very fine tip brush. This is the Games Workshop S layer brush, and you'll also see as I take paint from the palette I'm actually twisting the brush as I pull it away so as to get the brush to a very fine tip. I have to repeat this over and over and over because I only want to paint a fairly thin line on each of these very small carapace plates. The other thing about painting like this is you will occasionally have to re-wet the paint to stop it drying out and also stop your brush drying out. So I've just rinsed off the brush, added a bit of water to the palette, and now I can carry on. This section directly underneath the tail is where it gets a little bit tricky to show it to the camera. I'm doing my best to show it to you, but as you can appreciate, I've sort of upturned it once or twice, and it would be very easy to show you the base of the block of wood rather than the underside of the tail. So I've twisted it round, and I'm hoping you can see continuing the same steps. It occurred to me later that I could probably have mounted this slightly differently for this stage so that I could get all the way around each plate, but I'll get onto that later. Now, despite what I said earlier, because these plates are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, I'm actually just doing the line at the edge and the line in the center, and the line at the leading edge. There's no lines in between at this stage because I'm worried about it forming one continuous color rather than a striated pattern. Now moving on to the other side, exactly the same thing again. Obviously I've got to make sure that the center area overlaps so there isn't a gap in the middle, but other than that we're going over the leading edge of each carapace plate, and then where possible a thin line between the edge and the very center, like here. But if that's not possible, I'm just leaving it out. It really depends on the size of the plate and how confident I'm feeling that I can get a very thin line in between the two. I'm hoping that you can also see at this early stage that it is adding quite a bit of extra contrast. You can already see the blue is a bit more clear next to the red and next to the black. So that before the deep blue wasn't actually that clear, but in combination with the Sotek Green now actually starts to stand out really well. And then I'll go to an even lighter blue called Temple Guard Blue after this, and then the contrast will be even more noticeable. Now, because of this wire mounting system that I've got, the tail is wobbling about a bit, so I've actually had to steady it by putting my finger underneath it. Not ideal if any of those sections are still wet, so you're probably guessing that this has had a little bit of time to dry, so that this is not actually getting paint all over my fingers and in turn possibly messing up the paint job. So it's just to steady it, it's not that I necessarily need to press it or that the paint is still wet or anything like that. Now the fun part, trying to figure out how to paint this side, which is getting closer and closer to the wire and actually still being able to show it on camera. So here I'm using my finger again to steady it. It's not perhaps the ideal position because you might see that I'm having to paint very close to my finger. It doesn't really matter if I paint on my finger, I just don't necessarily want to then reposition the finger and end up pressing blue paint in the wrong place. So hopefully this will be enough that you can actually see it, and hopefully won't be painting my finger all over. Now this is the really tricky bit by the wire, because for most of it this mounting method is perfectly fine, but for just these last few plates it is a little bit awkward. So I've taken a short break to let it dry, and then I'm going to try and see if I can just get in there and still show it to the camera, even though these plates are small and are very close to the wire now. Now, as we get towards the end of this tail section, we're just doing the last few tiny little plates, and then we can move on to the tail tip. Luckily, the tail tip only has a few overlapping plates, and they're all much bigger, so it's a lot easier to paint the end. I'm just washing away a bit of paint that's got into the wrong place by adding a load of water to the brush. That instantly dilutes the paint, and then I just wick it away by putting a dried brush up against the surface, and then it absorbs the water, which I then absorb into tissue. Alright, so I'm just reinforcing the centers just to make sure there's no gap between the colours. It seems like a small step, but it is one of those little steps that just makes your paint just a little bit better quality, because of course if you go over it you might find there's no gaps at all, nothing to do, but if you find a slight gap it's easy to correct now. Now, it may be slightly unnecessary to do every single one, but doing this does ensure consistency of colour right in the centre, which does tend to be a bit of a focal point on these particular plates. So there you go, that's all of those done. Now we still have the tail tip to do. So as you can see, we're painting these little overlapping plates. These are a bit more like the sort you get on the modern Tyranids, very prominent overlapping patterns, and they're nice and broad, so it's very easy to do parallel lines like I'm doing here. So we're doing one plate at a time, and we just do a line at the edge and then some lines at about 90 degrees to that should run parallel to one another to build up the pattern. Now you may think I'm being excessively careful with this final plate on top, but it is actually surrounded by a darker surround and I don't want to get blue paint on those pieces, so I'm actually doing the same pattern but it's actually contained So I've got to be careful not to go over the edges, or I'm going to have a lot of correction to do later. So forgive me if this seems to be a bit laboured, but this is just the shape that I'm working with. Now, I did say earlier that I'd get onto using a different mounting style, and I've just broken the super glue that's holding this on, and it turns out that's lifted this part of the tail up where I can get to it and show it to the camera. So that's what we call a happy little accident. Apologies for the excellent shot of my thumb there. Wasn't my intention. I am genuinely trying to show you this to the camera. But there you go, just in the line down the edge, and then striations at 90 degrees, and then we're pretty much done with the tail. And then, believe it or not, the next few sections don't actually take too long, simply because there isn't half as much carapace on them. So although there seems to be a lot of clips of the tail, it's because it has the most armor plates on it. So we're going to move on to the head, which, as you can see, it's only actually these few plates on top that need doing, which means by comparison with the tail, it's like doing the tail, but only a tiny short section of it. Now, because these are so small and are so close to very highlighted red flesh, I'm actually being very careful to do these plates, starting with the first one and being the most careful, and then just going along, trying to get it up to the edge and no more, because if I go over the edge, I'm going to have a lot of error correction to do later on. There we go, that didn't take long. That's actually the head done. Moving swiftly on. The arms don't actually have very much carapace at all, although they have things like claws and weapons and so on that need doing later. This section is actually extremely brief because it is just the one shoulder pad on each side, and of course whilst I need to be careful to do the whole edge and then a series of striations, the fact is there actually isn't that much area to paint. So this particular step will go fairly quickly. Now, again, with this older model, there are some details that aren't on the newer model, so there are actually some divots in this shoulder carapace. So what I'm trying to do is get all of these striated lines up on the raised sections only, rather than down in the divots, if you see what I mean. So that it would logically be in those places, rather than having the divots brightly coloured and the surroundings darker, which would just be a bit weird. Hoping you can see what I mean here, just painting the raised areas rather than the sunken areas, and then trying to help them blend with the edge by painting the lines ever so slightly thicker. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with the lighter colour here, because obviously the Temple Guard blue will still have to be on the raised areas. So that's that arm done, and now finally we just have the gun arm, which again, whilst the gun will all be different colours, there's only this small piece of carapace. So same as the other side, we paint a line along the edge. We don't worry too much about the side of the carapace, it's just the leading edge and then a series of striations on the upper part, and then you're done. Now given that these plates are so large, you can use a bit of artistic license. You don't have to be super precise or have a line that's exactly straight. It can be ever so slightly tapered, for example. And how many you put in is completely up to you. I'm trying to put them on most of the raised parts here. They're less pronounced on this side than the other side, but then, as I've said before, this is typical of the older metal models. Right, so that's done. I'm going to show you a couple of still pictures. So here we are, that's the tail section done, as you can see, to match the torso and the legs. And then after that, we've got all of the pieces. So that's where it is right now.
Right, if you watched this far, first of all, thank you for watching. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. If you liked it, please hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell-shaped icon so you can get notifications about future videos. I hope they will be coming out soon.